Hey, welcome back to Garbardia. I have the next part of the Veil Rider series right here. Schedule may get a bit wonky due to some work stuff where my supervisor dipped out, all kinds of fun garbage. So, my apologies if things don't quite come in on time or as regularly as they did. But for now, enjoy this part of the story. The next few days proceeded in a flurry of paperwork and crunch training for any and all auxiliary companies that volunteered for the push out to Sanrion. As one could expect, every company wanted to go, so in the end, there was a base-wide raffle to see just who was going. Spittlejack's Reapers were one of the first ones pulled from the draw, and they happily added another streamer to their battle standard with the phrase, "First Picked," stitched onto it. Yule was unsure how long Focket was going to take with his request. While the dwarves seemed to be full of magical handicraft, it was a tall order that Yule had requested, and he began making plans around it just in case it fell through. To deal with the armor coming through the veil, Yule had enough belchers ready in their rune-shaped charges, but he was not confident that they could pin through the composite plating that most modern vehicles sported for their frontal armor. He only had one vehicle to really test it on, after all, and the Paladin was a precious commodity that could not be wasted so frivolously. It was one night in a bath that Yule had the idea of seeing if they could be fired by horseback, and testing was done the next morning. To help the horse, they engineered a kind of earplug for the horse's ears, so that way the horse wasn't in the business of losing their ability to hear after one shot. Recoil tests were then done, the engineers took the test belcher and made a few modifications, and eventually the recoil was reduced to a dull body punch than the ripping rocket blast that it normally was. The belcher mirrored the German Panzerschreck in every way, except for the opening of the rocket tube having a face on it with its mouth open, usually a dwarven face, a troll, and they were even working on putting more of the other species' heads on the tubes as well. The screeching harpy faces would usually have a device inside that made it emit a high-pitched screech when fired, which scared the ever-living shit out of anything within 50 yards of it. The belcher could be used on horseback as long as the backblast was clear, a lesson the Veil species learned very early on after the humans put a watermelon behind the tube and did a test fire to prove a point. Yule gave the horse he was on top of many treats after the test fires through the day, as while smart for a horse, the elven horses liked explosions as much as any other equine, no matter the dimension. This knowledge in hand and date night with the Fey troops looming ever closer, Yule called the drawn company leaders into the command bunker, which many were just calling headquarters now that it no longer resembled a bunker and more a proper building. With the Terran and Veil mid-level NCOs present, Yule let him in on his plan, and that he was needing volunteers to fill out his first dragoons, as well as a second and third dragoons for the first push. The dragoon units would be the tip of the spear, driving up through the line of advance to Domino's dugout and then straight into Sanrion if they could manage. They lacked vehicles and a good line of fuel, so their best lay of course was to use horses to their biggest advantage. They were quieter, could operate stealthily at night, and could move through densely wooded areas where a vehicle could not. Behind the dragoon columns would be everyone else moving up on foot to reinforce Sanrion if they managed to take it, or bolster the woodline dugout if they failed. A brim-touch staff sergeant raised his hand, his name tape reading Rojic. This brim-touch had an eye of extreme alley intelligence about him, and was one of the few brim-touched who trimmed down his horns for combat operations. Yule was taking more classes in Tunka, and was trying to do this without his amulet for once. "Sir, what about the Bradleys?" Yule tossed his pencil down to the table and put his hands on his hips. The command table had a huge map of the area on it, and Yule had been drawing over it with pencil. After a Valley Elf private made it known he could magic away markings, Yule had gone full bore on the pencil directions. "Well, Staff Sergeant Rojic, that's where the dragoons come into play. If Bradleys are present, you'll spread out, like this." Yule took out a sleeve of parchment and drew a single long square, then a column of smaller squares. Bradleys are armored personnel carriers. These will more than likely be carrying troopers in the rear of them. If they're able to pin us and deploy, we're cooked. So what we're going to do is ride up full steam with belchers ready. The most important thing is to not waste a shot on the turret or the front. What you do is you spread out, spur on as fast as possible, then try and outrun the gun that may be tracking you. He saw a few of the humans grimace. Yes, I know, it's a shit game, but we're playing with outdated hardware, fellas. We have to get in as close as possible, as quickly as possible, and get into the sides and rear of those vehicles. If, heavens forbid, an Abrams is there, treat it the same. Get in close, find the sides or the rear. If you're able to pin through the rear door, chances are you're going to shred the troopers within. Don't overthink it. Remember, they are your enemy, and they want to kill you just as badly. When you have fired your belcher, do your best to reload it by yourself, or have another rider assist you. Each rider is going to carry 3 spare rockets to facilitate this. You'll pull out another piece of parchment and begin drawing the top-down layout of a Bradley, pointing to his hatches. If by chance you are dehorsed and alive after the experience, you have 2 options. Sprint back to the safety of the trench line, or try and force your way into these things. Normally they will have the turrets locked, so you can't do this, but stranger things have happened. This is where the driver sits, and here are the gunner and commander locations. If you find one unlocked, or able to somehow get one open, put your weapon inside and shoot anything that breathes. If you cannot get inside, you can still partially blind the vehicle by smashing the optic panels and destroying the periscopes. You'll gesture to all these components in the rough places they would be on the Bradley, even doodling a few, and more of the Terran NCOs chipped in their own knowledge. Now, if there is a tank there, such as the Abrams, you kill it. Don't try to take it. Don't be a hero. You pump rockets into it until the turret pops off and the thing is on fire. You'll lean down onto the table and looked over the wood lines and the large expanse of space between where Domino was and Sanrion. He hoped that the Bradleys would be nowhere near the area, and even if they were in the city, he could have Domino pump smoke out of the mortars and screen their way in. Yule frowned and looked up into the faces of the soldiers in front of him. Make it clear, after giving your orders and retelling what I've said here, that the dragoons are going to experience heavy casualties. People are going to die purely because of the fact we have horses versus fighting vehicles. I'm expecting over half of us to not make it back here. Make it known, make it understood. Everyone in the room saluted in response, and Yule leaned back up, saluting them crisply back. When the meeting was over, everyone shuffled out, and Yule turned to Yethis, who had been hanging back in the background, listening. Yule had confided to her what he actually thought the death numbers would look like, and the time for that conversation had come. Yethis, have you made preparations with detail platoons? Yethis bowed slightly before she spoke, her face a mixed mask of resolution and sadness.
Yes, they will be ready to bury the fallen and collect names and patches. Are you still expecting over 80% casualties?
Yule's shoulders sagged and he felt tired. He looked down at the map and quietly cursed in his mind as he thought about what had to be done. Yes, and I will be leading them into it. I can't let my troopers go this alone while I'm in the rear, safe and sound. She stepped forward, placing a hand on his forearm. Her voice was soft and almost pleading.
You don't have to lead the charge. There are other people that can do that. If we lose you, morale will plummet.
If it gets as bad as I think it's going to get, Yethis, they're going to need something to rally around and keep fighting for. It would be irresponsible of me to send them out to their deaths and not be with them. The dragoons will have to pave the way for the rest of the troops coming in behind them, and if they must die, I will die with them. Yule pulled Yethis into a side hug, patting her shoulder with his hand as he stared down at the maps. It was reckless and desperate, but they had to button up the veil. Getting into Sanrion would allow for massive mortar emplacements to get set up and would let them shell the veil day and night. If he waited any longer or tried to push up more troopers on foot, they would be shelled, and there would also be the risk of vehicles ripping them apart as they moved in. Even with artillery support, the Bradleys had better optics and would clap them as soon as they charged in through the smoke on foot. It would be up to tactical horse movements to seize the city and outflank the vehicles, paving the way for the ground troops. The city of Emil Norris and Imra, Ira, Alora were doing their best to provide as many horses as possible that were war qualified, as well as driving any and all magic users to aid Yule. But there was so much more that a chain gun could do that a spell could not. Yule patted Yathis once more and tossed his pencil onto the map with a wooden clatter. This was not going to be pleasant, as if it ever was. Domino's ears were ringing and he held his palm to his eye, blinking blearily through the hazy, warbling view. That missile had caught him half-footed and he had barely enough time to duck his head down to avoid the majority of the blast. A few pieces of rock had skidded off his skull, though, and now his forehead was bleeding profusely. He heard people yelling around him, a dull and muffled sound, and looked over his shoulder in time to see Severus crash into him, bearing a med kit. She was screaming something at him, but he couldn't make it out, so he screamed something back that was cheerful and peppy. "Hey, pretty feathers!" Severus shook her head, eyebrows furrowed, and started ripping open the medical bag by force when the zipper got caught on its teeth. After rending the bag open, she slapped a living bandage to the large cut on Domino's head, and he kissed her on the cheek with a cheeky grin. Severus naturally thumped him on the other side of his forehead, and Domino saw her mouth the words, "Not the time, stupid," in Tunka. Domino blinked the blood out of his eye, his smile never faltering. "What? Combat is always a good time for mild flirting." Severus couldn't help but smile, and she shook her head again in a more soft way. The moment was ruined when the string of 25mm rounds impacted along the front of the trench and they both ducked, avoiding the small fragments of metal that flew around them. Domino popped his head back over the top of the trench slightly to peer out at the huge open field in front of them, spying the little blocks that were coming at full speed and cheering clouds behind them. There were constant flashes of light in front of them and then the impacts of whatever they were spitting out at the trench line. When it came to mornings, Domino had had better over the last few weeks, and this was not rating very high on the docket. They had completed a heavy mortar barrage into Sanrion only a few hours before the gunfire had begun, their heaviest yet, and they had been expecting maybe a probe or two to come by and try to shut them up with a little harassment. A tow missile blowing apart a piece of his trench line was not a part of those expectations, nor was almost having his eye ripped out of his skull. This wasn't the first push by the Chosen Children, and all of his platoons were whirling into action, manning the machine gun emplacements, and the hollow tunk of Belchers being loaded were echoing out all along the winding trench. The one kink in the battle plan was that there were no targets for the majority of his weapon teams, but he could at least maybe damage some optics on whatever was coming at them. He hoped there were only ASVs coming up, or maybe a Lynx or two, but he had an inkling that these may be those Bradleys that Yule was telling him about. Severus was having her boys and girls flying messages and ammo back and forth from the main base, their lifeline to keeping their mortar fire going. It was only a shame they couldn't carry troopers back with them. "Machine guns, I want 10-round bursts, fire for effect on target, space them out. Belchers hold fire, we don't have much ammunition for them." Domino was running up and down the trench yelling at the crowding auxiliaries that were pressing to the trench front, taking pop shots with their rifles simply to tell their enemy, "I'm here, fuck you, come and get some." Domino's mindset on battle was infectious, and after so many weeks together, it was almost as if there were platoons of Dominoes running around with mad grins on their faces. His leadership skills while under constant counter-barrage, assault, and probing by the enemy had kept morale soaring the entire time, even as casualties mounted on. Those who could fight did, even firing their weapons as their wounds reopened and soaked through their bandages. Those who couldn't fight in the trench still did what they could, manning the mortars or running around ammo to the best of their ability. Severus's talons were kicking up mud as she sprinted down the trench line, shoulder checking a brim touched out of the way as she ran down Domino.
"Domino, we can't fly, so to try and go up and get gunned down. We're grounded."
He nodded at her. "Get your wings into cover. Don't let them go up. We need them alive."
"What are we going to do then? We are harpies, we fly."
Severus was frustrated, and it showed in her face and eyes. They were not made and born for ground combat. They were born and made for aerial combat and acrobatics. Get your people a weapon they can use and stand by for borders, pretty feathers. Severus glowered at Domino. She hated it when he called her that, she really did, but he was showing remarkable leadership skills and a resolute contempt for fear when it came to combat, which was really growing on her. He also wasn't scared of her in the least and seemed to always find a way to stonewall her, even now in the trenches among the explosions. A valley elf's head detonated like a pumpkin nearby, a 25mm round skipping on the dirt on top of the trench and tumbling through his skull, showering the two and anyone else within a foot of him in brain matter and bone. Severus sniffed and flicked at a piece of skull cap on her cheek, while Domino brushed a bit of brain off his rolled sleeves absent-mindedly. It seems they're getting kinda close. Better have the mortars try and fire for effect. Also, you've got red on you. Domino pointed at a large splash of cranial fluid on Severus's wing, and she tissed, forming her face into a mask of annoyance. Domino didn't stick around to hear her retort, jogging along the trenches in the lines of firing guns to the rear dugouts where the mortars sat. Here the wounded were stacked, laying against the walls of the large dugouts either unconscious or barely clinging to the din of the world around them. The more able wounded were lounging near the mortar tubes, already uncasing the rune-etched high-explosive rounds. "Oof, you guys look like shit," Domino said, jogging to a halt in front of the main echelon leader, another brim-touch who was missing one of his low-angled horns. He was missing the top portion of his ear as well, and his own eye was covered in thick bandages which wept blood from moving around too much. "Hey, look who's talking, Sergeant Major." Domino and anyone awake had a good chuckle at the retort, and Domino ripped the full bandage from his head, tossing the blood-filled little creature over the side of the dugout. "Alright, so we got vehicles coming at us in a scattered formation. We're not going to be able to block it with them, so I want you guys to start dropping rounds 50 yards away from us and just push them back to 60, then bring them back to 50. Just have a saturated area fire that they have to drive through, but first drop smoke 25 yards from the trench line. Give us some cover." "Okie dokie." Everyone gave Domino a thumbs up and echoed his okie dokie with their own. The smoke rounds left the tubes before Domino had even jogged a couple of paces, and he took the small window of time to hop up on the side of the trench path and look out at whatever was coming at them. His heart sank as even from 200 yards away he could tell these were Bradleys coming at him, and both their coaxials and chain guns sang their song of death and demise towards the trench line. Casualties were light and a bit of maiming for the most part, but once they got close and were able to straddle the trench line, a single Bradley could just angle their gun down the line and decimate anything that sat within. He had to assume they were carrying troops as well, and would just walk the vehicles forward while the infantry mopped up whatever wasn't misted by the chain guns. The incoming fire was growing more intense by the second, and most of his troopers were starting to bunker down instead of picking pot shots at the boxes of doom coming at them. Domino strolled ahead and stood next to Severus and a pair of her Harpy Royal Guards, all of whom were getting Betty ready with the last of the dwarven armor-piercing rounds that had come in that morning. The smoke rounds began to hit the ground when Domino picked up his belcher, loading a rocket into the rear of it and cocking the front lever that would generate the current to fire it. The white smoke was beginning to billow, but a few appeared to have hit something hard in the ground which fouled their purpose, instead throwing up a little bit of white smoke, then dying in the ground. This did, however, leave Domino a target in front of him, a Bradley that was charging gamely across the field towards the trench. He brought the rocket up and laid it on his shoulder, and when he turned to check the backblast, he saw Severus rack the charging handle on Betty and let out a screech of rage, snarling her nose and pressing down on the butterfly. Betty chugged out her AP rounds at the charging Bradley, and the rounds bounced and whizzed off into the distance, her fire tracing along the line of them coming towards the trenches. Domino looked back at his target, squinted his eye, and fired, the tube rocking him harshly as the warhead was launched and sent hissing after his target. Domino shook his head and watched the Bradley as the rocket had a few seconds of flight time, and frowned when he saw the impact. It was a solid strike, cracking into the front of the armor plate, but from the lack of fucks given by the driver, must have struck the reactive plating. At the same time, Betty chunked to a stop beside him, and Severus looked to the Harpy on her left.
More ammo, Avize! Go, get more ammo!
Avize nodded and turned to run, but Domino halted her by catching her around the waist. Belay that, no use for it. They're gonna push past the mortar curtain and they'll be on us shortly. "Company!" Domino roared, turning and facing the bulk of his trench line. Heads came up and platoon sergeants began calling out in an echo to get the attention of their squads. "Affix!" Bayonets! Everyone paused in shock for a heartbeat before the platoon sergeants echoed the order, and the rasp of hundreds of bayonets leaving their scabbards hissed down the trench line. Severus turned and screeched out of the harpies who had bunkered down in cover, and a sudden flood of white-feathered Himalayas poured into the trench line as well, flexing their claws and baring their long-fanged teeth. Domino unslung his dwarven FAL and clicked a rune-etched bayonet into place, then held out his elbow to Severus. "Milady, the enemy will soon be upon us. Would you like to join me for a luncheon charge to the death?" Severus was still gripping Betty's handles, and she looked up into the twinkling green eyes of Domino with both confusion and slight admiration.
You're going to charge them?
Domino shrugged, his elbow still held out. Maybe we'll get lucky. Sure does beat dying in this trench. Feel the grass for the last time, not die like a cornered animal. Severus leaned back while holding on to Betty's handles and laughed dryly. She knew what Domino meant. These things would soon be on them in moments, and even now she saw them rushing towards the wall of mortar fire, churning up dirt and ground into the sky, as the smoke had died away. Belcher fire barked and thumped down the trench as the last of the ammunition was being used up, and only a few slowed down to a halt when their tracks were hit and rattled out from the drive wheels. Domino wanted to go out in glory, a final charge to the enemy, and he was kind enough to invite her personally to the battle. Severus could not run. She was Himalayan harpy royalty, and they have always flown to the combat, not run from it. It had been that way for hundreds of generations, and it was not going to change, not with her. After she had her laugh, she released Betty, who tipped forward with the weight of her barrel.
I agree. This trench would make for poor final resting place. Let us go touch the grass for final time.
The Himalayas watched as Severus placed her claw into the crook of Domino's arm, and Domino placed a whistle into his mouth. The harpies up and down the line began to chant an ancient harpy battle song, and each species followed suit, all of them taking up a chorus of songs in their mother tongues and from their own cultures. Domino's companies were going out loud and in style. "On the whistle!" Domino called out, and he pulled the whistle from his lips slightly, leaning down towards Severus as his order was echoed. She looked up at him, her face a grim but determined smile. "You know, I've always found you quite fetching, Pretty Feathers." Severus's smile grew into a toothy grin, and her grip on his elbow grew with more of her wing.
Who wouldn't? I am Severus, Queen of Himalayas.
Domino nodded in a sagely tone. "And you have very pretty feathers." She couldn't help but giggle at the human, and then set her face back into her determined last stand look.
Yes, that too.
Domino could feel the treads of the tanks vibrating the ground now as they closed the distance, and they sped past a mortar curtain with very little damage overall to their vehicles. It was worth a shot. He wasn't mad about it. Dirt was falling from the walls of the trench as the vibrations grew, and Domino knew it was time. They had a better chance of charging than staying in the trenches and dying. If they tried to run, they would get gunned down by either the Bradleys or their infantry disembarking and hunting them down. All his riflemen had stopped singing and were beating their rifle butts on the ground, thumping in rhythm with their bayonets glittering in the afternoon sun. The Bradleys were little more than 30 yards away now, and he brought the whistle up. "Ready, Pretty Feathers?" Severus nodded and breathed in deep.
Let us hope the gods smile down to us.
Domino nodded his head to the side. Quiet. Domino put the whistle in his lips and turned to look down the line of his trench before he blew. Now what he was expecting to do was to take one last look at his troopers and cement them into his memory, just in case he somehow lived through this. What he was not expecting was seeing Yule flying across the top of his trench on horseback and holding a belcher in his hands. After Yule, dozens more horses followed, until it was nothing but a sea of legs and bodies leaping over the top of the trenches and roaring down towards the Bradleys. Severus's head was whipping back and forth, shock playing on her face, and they both watched as in a matter of seconds almost an entire dragoon unit had leapt over the trench network. After them, another dragoon unit passed over, the riders bellowing out their war cries, the unit banners flapping in the wind, and belchers held close to their sides while others fired rifles or smoke canisters. Domino saw the third dragoon unit coming and blew his whistle shrilly. "Up and over, boys!" he roared, and pulled Severus with him, mounting the trench wall and sprinting down the slope of the fortification. Severus was giggling madly as she looked around and ran with Domino, while behind them, entire companies cried out in unison and thundered down the trench slope, their bayonets flashing and shining in the sunlight as the last dragoon unit swept to the right to go around the charge, and Himalayas took to the air with the cry of their queen in their throats. Yule landed hard on the other side of the trench and almost fell away from the saddle, clenching hard with his thighs. He coughed and righted himself, leaning down to keep a low profile as he looked around. They were running behind on time, and he had marched his dragoons through the night to get here, and they had only managed to barely get here in time. A few more yards and the infantry fighting vehicles would have been right on top of the trenches, which would have been a horrible fate for Domino and his troopers. He swung his horse right to avoid a barrel swinging his way, and the chain gun churned up rooster tails of dirt and earth behind his mount's hooves, only barely getting away by rounding around the front of a slowing Bradley. As he swung around the other side, he took aim with his dragoon belcher and point-fired at the side of another Bradley a few feet away. The detonation of something inside exploded with enough force to rip the rear door off and away from the hinges, the heavy steel ramp rolling across the field like a danger plate. The passengers inside the troop compartment were blown out as well, mostly in pieces, and Yule grimaced. It was not normal for a Bradley to concuss that hard, and the only thing he could think of was that there had been something stored inside of the vehicle that cooked off when the heat round pierced the armor. The turret hatches blew open as well after a few more seconds of cook-off, and flames poured out from the escape hatches. No one came out of them, and he assumed the entire crew to be cooked. He leaned right again and pulled out a spare rocket, fumbling with it in his belcher as the horse took them in a wide arc. He was having trouble getting the rocket in when he saw another Bradley ahead was trying to offload his troopers, and in a split decision, whirled his rocket around like a mace and mashed in the face of a southern elf that leapt down the ramp. The only noise Yule heard was the hollow crunch of the warhead denting facial bones and the gargle of the elf, but was quickly off and away before his compatriots had known what happened. He pulled out another rocket and looked around, and found it to be a chaotic circus. Dragoons were dashing back and forth around tanks and pumping belcher rounds into them at near point-blank ranges. It also saw that Domino had charged down from the trenches, apparently having affixed bayonets, and decided to not wait around for him to do all the work. It was not all fun and games for the dragoons, and the initial shock of their charge had worn off, and now the turrets were spinning back and forth, chain guns pumping out high explosive rounds in the horses with horrifying effectiveness. The screams of dying mounts and the sounds of gunfire was a noise Yule had never experienced, and he was not exactly super excited to indulge in it live and in color. He slammed his rocket home and knee-steered his mount to the left, looking for a target, and saw a Bradley pull a hard right, charging down the main assault line that had been following with his fellow vehicles. He brought up the belcher and fired, catching the Bradley's side armor at an angle when it lurched to the right, and while the warhead dug deep and spat payload into the interior, the turret still turned and tracked Yule. "Ah, fuck," Yule said matter-of-factly, and had enough time to pull his feet from the stirrups as 6 25mm rounds impacted the side of his horse. Yule hoped the death was instant as the rounds tore through the chest and belly of his mount, and Yule leapt from the saddle as the body came down hard onto the ground. He tucked and rolled, but nothing could help the impact at the speed he was coming down at. Other dragoons flew past him, and he rolled back and forth, dodging out of the way of hooves as the riders swarmed and pumped the assaulting Bradley with belcher fire. The Bradley rolled to a stop and its hatches flew open, the driver and gunners trying to wiggle out the back ramp coming down, and Yule pulled out his M9. Heaving for air, he came up to a kneeling position and pointed his pistol at the driver, spraying 9mm rounds in his direction until 2 struck him in the chest and neck. The elven driver slumped to the side and slowly slipped back into his seat, and Yule took aim at the rifleman now swarming out of the passenger compartment. A rifle round split through his left thigh and Yule roared, rapid firing his M9 at a pair of elves until the slide locked to the rear. One of the elves went down, but another female was able to stay standing, clutching her stomach and firing her rifle one-handed. Dirt impacts erupted around Yule as the elf began charging him, firing wildly with her rifle, and he stood, roaring in challenge and pulling out another magazine. He slammed it home in his M9 and fired twice, the bullets finding their mark in the chest of the southern elf, and she fell hard to the ground, screeching in pain and dropping her rifle. "Yule, take mine!" Yule spun around to the call and saw that Spittlejack was running his horse towards him, as well as holding out his dwarven FAL for him to grab. Yule snatched a rifle and Spittlejack whirled, leaping from his horse with dwarven war axe in hand and taking a southern elf to the ground. Spittlejack had 2 gunshot wounds already, one in his arm and another in his hip. But it didn't slow him as he hacked the elf on the ground to death, backhanding the rifle barrel away from him as if it were an annoying fly. Yule covered him and gunned down the rest of the passengers as they came around the rear of the Bradley, barely getting 5 steps into the battle as Dwarven 7.62x5.1 tore fist-sized holes through their bodies. Yule clutched his chest, feeling a broken rib, and turned around as Spittlejack sidled up beside him, pulling out a sidearm. Domino's forces had made it into the battle and were either engaging the disembarked troops in melee combat or seizing entire vehicles. Himalaya harpies screeched and pounced on Southern Elf troopers from above, biting deep into their flesh with claw, talon, and fang, or pinning them down with their strong legs as auxiliaries bayoneted them on the ground. There were still more than enough dragoons running around, and maybe he had only lost 10% of his initial forces, which was exceptional news. A Valley Elf private trotted up to them, saluting Yule. "Yule, what do we do now?" Yule pointed towards the approach of the Bradleys with his pistol. "Run down that way and see if anything else is waiting over there, then come back here." "Yes, sir." The elf spurred on his mount, Yule and Spittlejack watching as his horse kicked out small clouds of dirt from his speed. Spittlejack went to say something to Yule, but the scream of a horse caught both of their attentions, and they looked back towards the elf that had just departed. He had gotten maybe 30 feet away when he had hit something. The horse was toast, having rammed its skull into whatever it was it had hit, but the elf had been thrown onto something and was floating. Yule and Spittlejack stared on in apprehension as the elf rolled onto his stomach, looking up and around in confusion and pain, before a head popped up next to him out of thin air. A southern elf looked at the valley elf, then shrugged up his shoulder, pistol in hand. Yule turned and began to bellow out an order. Spittlejack turned and dove for cover behind the knocked-out Bradley, and the valley elf rolled through the air towards the ground, a neat hole decorating his forehead. One by one, dozens of LAV-25 scout vehicles materialized into view of the Dragoons and Domino's companies, their barrels pointed forward and rear doors already coming open to disembark their passengers. The Dragoons whirled about, heard Yule, and spurred on, flying towards an enemy that only lay a few yards away. They roared in defiance of the odds. They held their banners aloft proudly as the wind caught them, and the only noise that could meet them was the boom of the 25mm Bushmasters and the bark of the 240 Bravo secondary guns. Ordnance wrought ruin on flesh. Warheads spat their payloads through the thin frontal armor of the LAV-25s to snuff out those inside, and the screams of the dying echoed up into the sky. The Fae had changed the rules yet again. And that's the end of this chapter of the Veil Riders. Yeah, shit's getting pretty fucking whack with work. Supervisor fucking dipped out, so I'm the fucking captain now. And I went from like 3 to 4 days off to just barely having 2 days off. So I'm trying to fit in the writing where I can for both series. and then narrate them and then edit videos. It's gonna be a tough ride. But if you like this video and others like them, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel of Guardbeardia, as well click the bell icon so you know when the videos are released through the week. If you really like the videos, by all means donate to the coffee to help keep the series going. Also, be sure to share the stories with those who you may think will like them. It kind of helps get around with people, because not everyone looks for these kind of things on YouTube, usually on Spotify or podcasts and that kind of stuff. But anyway, thanks for hanging out. Thanks for listening. Thanks for enjoying, and thanks for supporting the channel. It helps in some ways you guys don't even understand, I'm pretty sure. But this has been Guard Bro, it's been the Bell Dam, and this has been Guardbeardia.